It all started the day my wife moved into the cabin with me. We had been fixing it up for months, excited to finally enjoy some peace and quiet away from the constant noise of city life. But the moment her car pulled into the driveway with a few boxes, it seemed like trouble was waiting right around the corner. Our neighbor, the self-appointed rule enforcer of the HO, came marching over before we could even get the front door open. She didn't introduce herself, didn't welcome us, didn't even smile. Instead, she launched straight into a speech about how outsiders couldn't just show up and move in without proper approval. I tried to keep things calm, but she was relentless, asking for paperwork, demanding to know if we were even allowed to be there, and threatening to call the HO board. My wife, who had just stepped out with her arms full of bags, gave her a polite smile and said we were simply moving into our own place. That only made Karen's face tighten even more. She huffed, pulled out her phone, and said she was calling the cops to report unauthorized occupants. By the time the officers arrived, my wife stood quietly by the porch while Karen waved her arms, insisting something illegal was happening. But when the officer asked for identification, my wife calmly reached into her wallet and pulled out something Karen hadn't expected. As soon as the officer read it, the entire energy shifted, and Karen's expression froze in shock. What she saw completely changed the course of that confrontation, and it was the last thing she ever imagined. The officer glanced at the ID, nodded with respect, and handed it back without hesitation. My wife didn't say a word, but the quiet confidence in her expression said everything. Karen, on the other hand, was suddenly at a loss for words. She shifted uncomfortably, her earlier boldness slipping away as she realized this wasn't just some random move-in she could control. Still, she didn't back down completely. Instead, she crossed her arms and muttered something about rules being rules, trying to save face while the officer gave her a look that suggested she was the one out of line. What Karen didn't know was that this cabin wasn't just a getaway spot for us. It had been in my family for years, passed down through generations. My wife and I had finally decided to make it our permanent home, a place where we could start fresh away from constant HO interference. But apparently, Karen had made it her mission to watch every driveway, monitor every lawn, and challenge anyone she thought didn't fit her picture of the neighborhood. The truth was, my wife had served years in the military, and she carried herself with a calm strength most people instantly noticed. That small card she handed over carried a weight Karen never expected. But instead of apologizing, Karen's eyes darted between us, calculating her next move like she wasn't ready to let it go. The officer stayed neutral, but I could see he was losing patience with her. My wife quietly stood by, letting Karen's frustration unravel. The tension was thick, and it was clear the standoff was only just beginning. Karen wasn't used to being challenged. From what I'd heard from other neighbors, she had been the unofficial gatekeeper of the community for years, the one who patrolled the sidewalks with a clipboard in hand, filing complaints about lawn lengths, porch lights, or even the color of mailboxes. People didn't like her, but most stayed quiet because they didn't want to deal with the stress of fighting her. Now, with us moving in, she saw an opportunity to flex her authority, and she wasn't about to let go easily. The officer, sensing the rising tension, reminded Karen that ownership records were clear and that we had every right to live in our own cabin. But instead of calming down, she pivoted, claiming we were violating HO bylaws by bringing in too many vehicles and planning to turn the place into something it wasn't meant to be. It was clear she was grasping at anything to keep control. What made things even stranger was how other neighbors began peeking out from behind curtains, watching the scene unfold. A few even stepped onto their porches, whispering among themselves. I realized this wasn't just about us. It was about years of Karen's intimidation finally being dragged into the open. My wife stood steady, but I could see the flicker of frustration in her eyes. She had dealt with far worse during her service, but that didn't make it easier to face someone determined to make our lives miserable over petty rules. As the officer tried to steer the conversation back to facts, Karen's voice grew sharper, her accusations wilder. She wasn't just questioning our move-in anymore. She was hinting at bigger claims, ones that could stir even more trouble if left unchecked. And the way she looked at us, I knew she wasn't finished. Karen's voice carried across the street now, loud enough for everyone to hear. She wasn't just arguing with the officer anymore. She was putting on a performance for the whole neighborhood. She accused us of trying to sneak in without proper registration, of planning to rent the cabin out illegally, and even claimed we were disturbing the peace. None of it made sense, but the way she delivered it with so much confidence made the whispers from the neighbors grow louder. The officer tried to rein her in, reminding her that speculation wasn't proof, but Karen only grew bolder. She jabbed her finger toward my wife, saying people like us thought we were above the rules. The moment she said it, the air seemed to tighten. My wife didn't react outwardly, but I knew that comment had struck a nerve. She wasn't someone who demanded respect, but she had earned it through years of service, sacrifice, and discipline. Watching Karen dismiss her so easily felt like crossing a line. That's when the neighbors began to step closer, no longer content to just watch from a distance. One older man muttered that he was tired of Karen harassing people, while another neighbor shook her head, clearly embarrassed by the scene. The balance of power was shifting, but Karen either didn't notice or didn't care. She doubled down, insisting she would call the HOA board immediately, even though the officer was standing right there. The tension was reaching a breaking point. The officer's patience was wearing thin, my wife's calm was being tested, and the neighbors were gathering as though they expected something big to happen. And in that moment, I could tell whatever came next was going to change everything. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more heated, Karen pulled out a folder she had been carrying under her arm the entire time. She flipped it open dramatically, waving papers like they were undeniable proof of our supposed violations. She claimed she had documents from the HOA office that showed we weren't listed as permanent residents and therefore had no right to stay in the cabin full time. The crowd of neighbors leaned in, curious, while the officer frowned, clearly unimpressed with her theatrics. My wife and I exchanged a glance. We knew those papers couldn't possibly be official because we had already handled all the ownership paperwork weeks before moving in. But the way Karen shook them in the air made the scene feel like a courtroom showdown. She was trying to turn public opinion against us, betting that the neighbors would rally to her side once she presented evidence. But then something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors, a woman who had lived there for years, stepped forward and said she recognized those same forms because Karen had once used them against her too. Another man added that he'd been threatened with fines after Karen dug up rules that didn't actually exist in the HOA handbook. The crowd murmured louder now, not against us, but against her. Karen's face reddened, but she refused to back down. Instead, she raised her voice, saying she would escalate this to the full HOA board and have us removed if necessary. Her stubbornness only raised the stakes higher. The officer was clearly deciding how far he'd let this go, and the neighbors were choosing sides right before our eyes. The tension was no longer just between us and Karen. It was becoming a community battle. The officer finally held up his hand, cutting through the noise. His tone was calm but firm as he explained that property ownership records left no doubt. We were the legal owners of the cabin, and nothing in the HOA bylaws prevented us from living there full time. He added that waving around unofficial papers didn't change that fact. Karen opened her mouth to argue again, but before she could, one of the neighbors stepped closer and said loudly, "Enough is enough. You've pulled this stunt with all of us, and we're tired of it." That broke the silence. More neighbors spoke up, each sharing their own run-ins with Karen. Stories of false violations, unnecessary fines, and late-night confrontations spilled out, and for the first time, Karen was the one on the defensive. Her confidence faltered as the crowd turned against her, and the officer made it clear if she continued causing unnecessary disturbances, she could face consequences herself. My wife remained quiet through it all, but when the officer turned to thank her for her service after reviewing her military ID again, the look on Karen's face said everything. She had tried to humiliate us, only to be completely disarmed by the truth. Just as the crowd began to disperse, and it seemed like the conflict was over, the unexpected twist came. One of the neighbors revealed that the HOA board had recently been investigating complaints about Karen's behavior, and that she might actually be removed from her self-appointed role. The color drained from her face. For once, Karen had no comeback. What began as her attempt to drive us out ended with her standing exposed in front of the entire neighborhood. And in that moment, the cabin truly felt like home. After the officer left, the neighborhood slowly settled back into a quiet calm. A few neighbors came over to introduce themselves properly, apologizing for not stepping in sooner and admitting they had been dealing with Karen's behavior for years. It was strange how one loud voice had been able to keep so many people on edge, but now that the curtain had been pulled back, the fears seemed to fade. For the first time since moving into the cabin, I felt like we weren't standing alone. My wife, as always, stayed composed. She brushed off the tension of the night like it was nothing new, though I knew it meant more to her than she let on. Her military ID had done more than prove who she was. It reminded everyone that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. Seeing Karen's bravado crumble in the face of that truth was something neither of us would forget. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in the community. The whole board sent out an official notice that they were reviewing Karen's position and considering changes to how rules would be enforced. Neighbors started waving more often, stopping to chat, and treating us less like outsiders and more like part of the neighborhood. The cabin felt alive in a new way, not just as a home, but as a place where we could finally breathe. Karen kept her distance after that day. Whether out of embarrassment or because she knew her influence was slipping, she no longer stormed across yards with threats. And for us, the biggest lesson was simple. Sometimes standing your ground not only protects your own peace, it gives others the courage to do the same.